It began, as these things often do, with something deceptively ordinary. I was walking along the towpath between the college's Magdalen spires behind me, Christ Church's meadow ahead, and the river moved with that sluggish autumn indifference peculiar to Oxford, when the water no longer glitters but thinks. A punt drifted idle near the bank, the pole half lost in the weeds, and I remember thinking it looked abandoned by thought itself. The drizzle had that peculiar persistence one only notices after it has soaked through. There was a woman on the opposite bank, her coat too red for the weather, and a man speaking to her with the deliberate calm of someone rehearsing restraint. I could not hear their words, only the cadence, clipped, deliberate, dangerous. The wind flattened his last sentence into silence, and when I looked again, she was gone. Only the man remained, staring at the river as if waiting for it to reply. Lewis was already late for our meeting, but punctuality was a vice he reserved for paperwork. I went into the little cafe by Folly Bridge, the one that always smells faintly of damp bread and overboiled coffee, and took a seat by the window. The newspaper lay folded on the counter, body found near Christ Church meadow. The irony wasn't lost on me, it seldom is. She was called Eleanor Dray. A postgraduate at one of the smaller colleges, St. Aldate's perhaps, though that might be misremembered. 26, specializing in restoration poetry, and, according to the article, last seen walking by the river the previous evening. They used the word tragically to describe her death, which usually means prematurely and inconveniently for everyone else. Lewis arrived with rain on his coat and sympathy in his eyes. He said they'd called us in because of the odd circumstances. Odd, in Oxford, is a broad church. He poured himself tea and muttered something about suicide. I told him not to be so literal. People seldom come to the river to die unless they mean to be seen doing so. We walked later that morning to the site. Police tape, of course, though fluttering uselessly in the wind. Students watched from under umbrellas as if waiting for a second act. The body had already been removed, leaving only the indentation in the grass where she'd lain, and a single glove caught on a branch. Brown leather, small left hand. The right glove was nowhere to be seen. I asked the constable if anyone had found a matching one downstream. He said no. I told him not to bother if the river keeps what it wants. The college porter remembered her vaguely. Quiet, punctual, fond of walking after evensong. A tutor described her as diligent but distracted. One of those words is always a lie. In her room we found books arranged by author rather than title details, which, for reasons I couldn't explain, troubled me more than the body. The kettle still held water. A copy of The Rape of the Lock lay open on the desk, its margins scrawled with small, neat handwriting. What dreadful ghosts of beauty haunt the mind? I closed it gently, as if it might bruise. I asked about friends. There was one fellow researcher, male, fond of long walks and longer silences, the kind of man who prefers questions to answers. I had seen his face that morning by the river. Back at the station, Lewis showed me the preliminary report of accidental drowning, though I suspect they wrote it to fill a space rather than express belief. I looked at the map spread across the desk. The river wound between the colleges like a thought unfinished, and I traced it absently with my pen. Between the spot where she'd fallen and the point where she'd been found, there was a bend, and at that bend a small landing private, neglected, known only to those who needed seclusion. It was there I felt sure that the truth had paused, taken breath, and stepped away from itself. That night I stood again on Folly Bridge. The lamps flickered gold across the current. A student laughed somewhere behind me, that bright, untroubled laughter that belongs only to those who still believe time is patient. I lit a cigarette, though I'd promised not to, and watched the smoke mingle with the mist. There are deaths that begin in passion and end in despair, and others that begin in silence and end there too. I wasn't yet certain which kind this was, but I knew with the quiet certainty that only solitude allows that something in the river's slow turning held an answer, or perhaps merely a reflection of one. I walked that path again the next morning, though the rain had turned from a drizzle into something more deliberate. The city was awake but unwilling, its bicycles slick with dew, its bells reluctant to sound. Oxford always seems at its most secretive when the term is half gone, when the air itself holds the fatigue of too many essays, too many prayers muttered under arches. The path by Magdalen Bridge curves slightly as though it knows better than to offer a straight truth. There were flowers left there now, the usual gesture of pity from people who never met the dead. I've never trusted flowers. They say more about the living than the departed. Lewis met me by the gate, his collar up, his face carrying that permanent worry of a man who fears he's missed something obvious. He told me they'd found the other glove caught against a mooring post near the boathouse. I said nothing. I didn't need to. A left and a right returned to one another, too late to be of comfort. The river was swollen with rain, and I watched it a long time before speaking. There's a strange intimacy between water and death, perhaps because both have such patience. Lewis asked if I thought she'd fallen. I told him no. Falling implies surrender, and Eleanor Dray hadn't been the surrendering sort. Her notes suggested someone who wrestled with thought until it yielded, even if only to exhaustion. I'd seen her handwriting elegant, precise, the kind of script that holds emotion in its margins. Across the bridge, a student was sketching the chapel tower, her pencil moving quickly, impatiently. I noticed the small rhythm she made with her heel, a nervous tapping against the stone. It reminded me of Eleanor's tutor, who'd done the same during our brief interview. The same pulse of unease carried from pupil to teacher. The sort of detail that means nothing until it suddenly means everything. We went to the college again after lunch. The porter greeted us with that rehearsed solemnity Oxford men adopt when tragedy trespasses on their routines. He said there had been visitors in the night reporters, of course, and one woman who'd refused to give her name. She'd asked if Eleanor's window faced the river, and when told yes, she'd left without another word. I asked him to describe her. He said she wore no hat, though it had been raining. I told him that meant more than he realized. The room was as we'd left it, though the smell of wet wool lingered. Someone had been sitting there recently. I traced my fingers across the spine of a book, The Anatomy of Melancholy. Marginalia again, this time less measured, a single line drawn beside the passage on self-slaughter. The ink is still faintly damp. Lewis, ever hopeful, suggested she might have been depressed. I told him depression seldom quotes Burton so accurately. This was intellect, not impulse. Outside, the bells of Magdalen began their noon descent, slow and sonorous, as if time itself were being lowered into the ground. The sound carried down the path, over the bridge, to the river, where the current gathered everything that refused to stay still. I walked alone after we parted, following the path as it narrowed toward the meadow. The wind pushed the reeds into restless patterns. At the edge, near where the water deepened, I saw footprints, small, deliberate, leading not toward the bank, but away from it. Someone had stood there recently, watching. Perhaps waiting. The prints faded into the gravel, erased by the drizzle's persistence. That night I tried to read her notes again. A reference to a poem by Marvell, half finished. But at my back I always hear the rest was missing. I closed the notebook and turned off the light. Even now, when I pass that path, I find myself glancing toward the river's slow turn beneath the bridge, not out of fear or fascination, but from the faint, unreasonable hope that something left unsaid might still be waiting there quietly, patiently, for someone willing to listen. I went to see her tutor that afternoon, a man named Havisham. The name alone carried the faint odour of privilege and disapproval. He lived in a set of rooms high above the quad of St Aldate's, one of those corners of Oxford where the air never quite moves, as if afraid of disturbing old certainties. The staircase creaked like a reluctant confession. He greeted me with what might once have been a charm. A scholarly man, or the idea of one, waistcoat slightly too tight, hands yellowed by tobacco, a face that looked as though it had outlived sincerity. He asked if I'd take whiskey. I said yes. The glass he offered was older than the drink. He spoke of Eleanor as an excellent student, diligent, intelligent, and curiously solitary. That phrase lingered, curiously solitary, as if solitude required explanation in a city built for it. I asked when he'd last seen her. 2 days before her death, he said, in supervision. They had discussed the Pope's use of irony. She had been, he said, distracted. He'd assumed romance. They always do. While he spoke, I watched his fingers move along the desk's edge, tracing a faint pattern in the dust, a habit of mind that sought order even when words failed it. On the mantelpiece, beside an unopened letter, stood a photograph of Eleanor among a small group of students at a summer garden party. Everyone was smiling except her. The absence of expression seemed deliberate, as though she knew even then how fragile the picture's happiness would prove. He mentioned that she had once accused another student of plagiarism. The matter had been quietly resolved, meaning, of course, concealed. I asked the name. He hesitated, waited not with guilt, but with fear of gossip. Then he said Callum Rees, a promising scholar with the sort of charm that usually precedes ruin. I thanked him and rose to leave. At the door, he stopped me. There was something else, he said. A note left in his pigeonhole the morning after her death. No signature. The handwriting is familiar but disguised. It read only, "The bridge remembers." He had thrown it away, he said. I told him he should have kept it. He poured another drink instead. Outside, the air had grown colder, as though the city were holding its breath. I walked through the quad where the students moved like ghosts beneath the lamps, their laughter thin against the stone. From somewhere nearby came the echo of a piano, slow, uncertain, the notes drifting out through an open window and dissolving before they reached the ground. There are moments in every investigation when one hears something not a fact, but the faint sound of coherence taking shape. The words, "The bridge remembers," struck me as absurd, and yet somehow right. The bridge between the living and the dead, between truth and convenience, between what is said and what is meant. And then smaller bridges hold footprints. If she had met someone there, the evidence might not be in what remained, but in what had been deliberately erased. I found myself back on Magdalen Bridge almost without intending it. The rain had stopped, but the stones still glistened, carrying the scent of wet ivy and iron. A constable was stationed there now, bored, shuffling his boots. I looked down at the path below, where the water pressed against its boundaries with quiet insistence. In the distance, a single light glowed in the window of Eleanor's college room. It trembled slightly, as if disturbed by breath. For an instant I thought I saw a shadow move behind the glass, not a person, but the residue of one. Oxford, I've learned, never buries its ghosts. It simply rearranges the furniture around them. I turned to go, the words still turning in my head. The bridge remembers. Perhaps it did. Perhaps it always had. It was late afternoon when I saw the woman at the boathouse, not quite young, not yet old, wrapped in a raincoat that had once been elegant and was now only serviceable. She was standing by the river as though waiting for an appointment that might never come. I'd passed her twice before without giving her thought, but that day the pause in her posture held a kind of purpose I could no longer ignore. The river was restless, full of pale reflections and the sound of oars clinking in the distance. The sky, too low for comfort, pressed its dull light against the water until both became indistinguishable, one melancholy stretched between two surfaces. I approached without intention, as one might drift toward a piece of music overheard in another room. She turned before I spoke. Her face was unremarkable in the way that memory prefers, though her eyes were not. They were the grey of unpolished silver, and they looked at me with the weary curiosity of someone who had expected to be found. She said she had heard I was asking questions about Eleanor Dray. Her voice held no tremor, yet there was the faintest delay before the name, as though she feared to bruise it. I asked how she knew her. A long pause, and then I used to row for St. Aldate's. Eleanor watched us sometimes, though she didn't row herself. She was always sketching something, she said, mostly the water. Sometimes people. I asked if she'd ever drawn this woman. Perhaps, she said, and turned away. Behind her the boathouse loomed like an old confession wood, darkened by weather, ropes coiled in patterns that once had meaning. There was a faint scent of petrol and damp straw. I noticed a bicycle leaning against the wall, its tires flecked with mud from the towpath, the sort of detail most people forget to erase. Lewis had gone to fetch the caretaker. I watched the woman trace her fingers along the railing, as if reading something invisible written there. She asked, almost idly, if I believed in accidents. I told her I believed in timing. She smiled faintly. So did Eleanor, she said once. Then she asked whether the police had found what they were looking for. I told her we rarely did. That answer seemed to satisfy her. When Lewis returned, she was gone. Only the bicycle remained, and a single wet footprint leading toward the water's edge. He said she'd been seen before a visitor, perhaps, or one of the rowing club's old members. The caretaker didn't know her name, but he recalled her habit of coming at dusk and leaving just before the gates were locked. Inside the boathouse, the air was close, thick with the smell of varnish and rope. The light fell, unevenly touching the blades of the oars stacked along the wall. Lewis found an envelope on a bench, slightly damp, addressed in a careful hand to no one in particular. It contained a photograph of Eleanor again, on the same riverbank, head turned, hair pulled back against the wind. There was something almost unfinished about her expression, as though she had been caught mid-thought, waiting for the rest of the sentence to arrive. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded ink, Magdalen, Michaelmas term. Nothing more. Yet something about the handwriting disturbed me. The loop of the M, too delicate for a man, too precise for indifference. I had seen that loop before in the margin of the Rape of the Lock, beside a line about memory and betrayal. Outside, the bell at Christchurch struck 5. The sound rolled over the water like a reminder of continuity, how Oxford insists on rhythm even when reason has failed. I watched the river shift its colour beneath the bridge and thought again of the woman's question. Accidents. I suppose there are such things, but not in the lives of those who think too deeply. When I looked back toward the boathouse, the bicycle had vanished. It arrived in the Morning Post among the usual debris of college life circulars, committee minutes, and the eternal pleas for donations disguised as gratitude. A small, cream-coloured envelope, the paper thick and faintly scented of tobacco. No return address. The handwriting, elegant, slanted and deliberate, reminded me of someone trying to appear calm. Inside was a single sheet, folded once, and on it a phrase written in Greek tapanda rei. Everything flows. The irony was unsubtle, though Oxford seldom lacks those who mistake cleverness for depth. Still the phrase stayed with me, her body in the river, the bridge, the footprints, the woman who vanished as easily as a ripple fades. Everything flows indeed. Lewis found me staring at it in my office, the blinds half drawn against a reluctant morning. He asked if I'd finally taken up philosophy. I told him I'd never been much good at pretending the world made sense. He poured the tea, too strong as usual, and mentioned that the handwriting matched none of the letters in Eleanor Dray's room. I said it wasn't meant to. It was written for someone who could read between languages. I took the note to the Bodleian later that day. There's a comfort in old libraries, the weight of unspoken thought pressing in from all sides. Dust, leather, time. The Greek section smelled of rain caught in paper. The librarian on duty, a thin man who looked perpetually surprised by life, confirmed the phrase came from Heraclitus, a philosopher obsessed with flux. I said I understood the sentiment better than I wished to. He looked at the handwriting and frowned. Not modern Greek, he said, but the hand of someone classically trained, likely an academic. I asked if there were many of those in Oxford. He smiled faintly. Thousands, he said, all certain they're the last of their kind. I walked out into the quad. The rain had begun again, thin and persistent. Students hurried past, heads bowed like penitents. Across the lawn I saw Havisham speaking to a woman, the same one I'd met at the boathouse. She caught my eye for an instant before turning away, her hand tightening around a folded umbrella as though restraining a confession. Havisham, seeing me, raised a hand in greeting. I didn't return it. Later, in my room, I spread the contents of Eleanor's file across the table. Her essays, her letters, the small drawings she'd made in the margins. I'd read them before, but grief, I've learned, hides its clues in repetition. One note in particular caught my attention. A draft of an article she'd never finished, titled "The Language of Silence in Restoration Poetry." In the margin, beside a quote from Dryden, she'd scribbled the same Greek phrase, tapanda rhea, and beneath it, faintly, as though unsure of her own meaning, the English translation, "Everything moves toward forgetting." Lewis arrived with news from forensics that the note had been written with the same fountain pen found in Havisham's study, though he insisted he had been missing for weeks. Lewis believed him. I wasn't certain belief was useful anymore. That night I returned to the bridge. The wind moved low and slow, carrying with it the smell of wet stone and the faint tang of diesel from the passing punts. I lit a cigarette, the flames struggling in the damp air. The water below was dark and restless, mirroring the lights of the colleges. I took the note from my pocket and held it up to the glow of the street lamp. The ink shimmered faintly, as if the words were still in motion. It was then that I noticed something I'd missed before. The tail of the final letter, the omega, was slightly extended, curling upward in a way that betrayed habit, not affectation. I'd seen it once in the Bodleian sign in the ledger, beside a single name written earlier that same week, C. Rees. I folded the paper again, slowly, and slipped it back into my coat. Lewis would call it progress. I wasn't sure it was. Some truths, like rivers, don't want to be crossed. The clock on Tom Tower began to strike 9. Each chime lingered longer than the last, as though the city itself were trying to hold its breath. I watched the river until the sound faded, and for a moment, brief, fragile, absurd, I thought I could hear the echo of her voice, speaking in Greek. Not accusation, no apology, merely the language of motion. There are rooms in Oxford that seem to remember more than the people who inhabit them. The one they called the Greek Room was such a place, a small, high-ceilinged chamber tucked into the upper corner of St. Aldate's, reserved for the study of dead languages and those who pretended to understand them. I had been there once before, years ago, when life felt less finite. I remember thinking even then that its silence had weight. Lewis walked with me up the narrow stairway, his shoes echoing on the stone. He disliked the place immediately. The air felt untouched, he said, too still for comfort. The door creaked when I opened it, as if it resented the interruption. Inside, the light from a single window filtered through dust like diluted gold. Shelves ran the length of the walls, filled with volumes that no one had borrowed in decades. At the centre stood a long oak table, scarred by generations of ink and thought. On it lay a small pile of papers, still faintly damp from the morning's rain, and beside them a cigarette stub resting on the rim of an empty teacup. Someone had been there recently. The college secretary said the room hadn't been used in weeks, though she mentioned that Havisham had a key. When I asked if anyone else did, she hesitated. There was another, she said, a postgraduate researcher, Callum Rees. His thesis, apparently, was on Heraclitus. Everything flows. I examined the papers. Notes on syntax, lexical comparisons, a passage from Heraclitus underlined, "Twice you cannot step into the same river twice." I could almost hear Eleanor's voice reading it aloud, her handwriting still vivid in my mind. I began to suspect the river was less metaphor than message. Lewis found a photograph tucked between two books, of a study group perhaps. Havisham again, Eleanor, beside him, and there in the corner, almost hidden by shadow, the woman from the boathouse. No name on the back this time, only a date Michaelmas, 2 years earlier. I traced the edge of the photograph with my thumb, the image slightly warped by water damage. Memory, too, warps in time. Something about the placement of the objects on the table struck me then. The teacup, the stub, the papers, arranged not carelessly, but symmetrically. I stepped closer. Beneath the pile of notes, faint indentations marred the wood letters pressed by a hand writing without a pad. I shaded over them with the side of a pencil from my pocket. The impression formed slowly, like a photograph emerging in solution. Ask him why he lied about the bridge. Lewis looked at me, puzzled. I told him the handwriting wasn't Eleanor's. It was finer, almost too careful, possibly a woman's. He asked what it meant. I said it meant someone had come here to remember, and someone else had followed to forget. We searched the cupboards, the drawers, the little recess behind the bookcase where dust had gathered like years. In the bottom drawer of the desk, we found another envelope, identical to the one that had contained the Greek note. Inside, only a blank sheet, save for a faint watermark, a stylized crest, 2 interlocking circles, forming the shape of an omega. The same symbol, I realized, that appeared on the flyleaf of Eleanor's copy of The Rape of the Lock. Outside, the bells of Magdalen began their slow ascent into evening. The sound folded through the air, gentle and unhurried, and I thought again of rivers and repetition. Perhaps the room was never about Greek at all, but about recurrence, how every truth, however buried, finds its way back into light, reshaped, mistranslated, flowing in circles. As we left, I turned once more toward the desk. The air seemed heavier now, as though aware of its own secrets. There was a faint scent of perfume, barely perceptible violet maybe. A trace left not by scholarship but by presence. On the staircase, Lewis asked, what I thought the note meant. I told him it wasn't a note. It was a warning, and like most warnings in Oxford, it had come too late. He had been waiting for me in the porter's lodge, though he wasn't the sort of man who looked comfortable waiting anywhere. Garth Melling, once a scholar of some promise, now reduced to that peculiar Oxford twilight where intellect curdles into regret. His coat was too thin for the season, his hair brushed with the anxious precision of a man who fears disorder more than guilt. He said he wanted to speak privately. His voice, when it came, was low, careful, with that strained civility peculiar to the remorseful. We walked together across the quad, the dusk settling like dust upon the stones. The sky above was an indecisive grey, and somewhere, far off, a bell rehearsed its own sorrow. He told me he had known Eleanor. Not well, he said, though the tremor in his hands contradicted him. He had been her examiner the previous term. She had impressed him. Quick mind, too quick perhaps, with a habit of seeing connections others missed. I asked what sort of connections. He hesitated. The kind that unsettle old men, he said at last. In his rooms, sparse, dim, perfumed faintly with ink and resignation, he poured whisky without ceremony. He told me that Eleanor had visited him shortly before her death. She'd come with a question about a translation, a passage from Heraclitus. But it wasn't the words that troubled her, he said. It was the idea behind them. Everything flows, everything changes. She'd asked if he believed it was possible to alter the meaning of truth simply by naming it differently. He'd laughed, he said, but she hadn't. She'd told him there was someone who'd done just that, changed the name, changed the story, and made a lie sound like an interpretation. She hadn't said who. The whisky glass trembled against the table. He admitted there'd been rumours about her and Havisham, about her and Rees, though gossip in Oxford, like ivy, grows even on clean stone. What mattered, he said, was a paper. Not an essay, but something more personal, a short piece she'd written and slipped beneath his door the night before she died. He hadn't read it. He'd burned it. Not out of fear, he said, but out of decency. I told him that decency was rarely the motive of destruction. He looked away, eyes fixed on some private gallery of memory. Then quietly, he confessed what I'd already guessed the paper hadn't been an essay at all. It had been a confession, not hers, but his. She had discovered something, a theft perhaps, or a deceit. He didn't specify, and I didn't ask. Some truths are unworthy of detail. She'd threatened to expose him, not to ruin him, he insisted, but to force him to acknowledge it. He said he'd begged her to reconsider, that she'd left without a word. The next morning, he'd seen her photograph in the paper. He asked if I believed in coincidence. I said I believed in timing, which is a kind of cruelty. He smiled, a hollow, tired expression that seemed to collapse halfway across his face. He said he'd thought of confessing to the police, but that the sin he carried no longer had a name in law. It had eroded into something softer, less punishable remorse, perhaps, or cowardice. As he spoke, I noticed the books on his desk, a small library of grief, Plato, Sophocles, a translation of Aeschylus marked heavily in the margins. One passage circled twice, the ink still fresh. We suffer from the truth. I pointed to it. He said it was the only line worth remembering. When I left him, the night had settled completely. The air smelled faintly of rain and cigarette smoke. Behind me, I heard the click of his door closing, that final, precise sound of a man sealing himself from consequence. Later, Lewis would ask what Melling had said. I told him little, and he didn't press. There was nothing to charge, nothing to prove. only a man who'd understood, too late, that knowledge is no shield against guilt. That evening, as I crossed the quad alone, I found myself thinking of Eleanor again. Her sharp intelligence, her quiet defiance, her question about language. Whether truth can be changed by naming it differently. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps the dead are only those who can no longer revise their version of the story. It was Lewis who found it small, rusted, unremarkable. The kind of key one might overlook even while holding it. He'd discovered it lodged in the gravel behind the boathouse, half buried, its chain snapped clean. He handed it to me without ceremony, the way one gives a thing away whose meaning one does not yet suspect. "A bicycle key," he said, nothing more. But Oxford thrives on such trifles. The city's great scandals are born from minutiae, a word misplaced, a glance delayed, a key fallen into gravel. I turned it over in my hand, the metal cold and faintly oily. There was a tiny engraving near the head, R.E. The initials were faint, worn by rain and use, but deliberate. I'd seen those letters before. On the back of a library slip in Eleanor Dre's notebook book, loaned to Re 12-10. I'd dismissed it at the time as routine. Now it hummed with quiet relevance. We took the key to the storage sheds by the river, where students kept their bicycles chained to iron racks. A faint drizzle had begun, that peculiar Oxford rain that seems to rise from the ground as much as it falls from the sky. Rows of bicycles leaned against one another like exhausted thoughts. Most were locked, some abandoned. I tried the key in the first few at random. Nothing. Then Lewis called out this one. A black rally, the rear wheel caked in mud, the seat torn. The lock clicked open with the resigned ease of recognition. On the handlebars hung a small leather satchel, soaked but intact. Inside, a notebook has pages stiff with water, the ink blurred to shadows. The initials embossed on the cover were unmistakable. C.R. Callum Rees. Lewis muttered something about coincidence, though we both knew better. Coincidence is the last refuge of the unimaginative. Back at the station, under the yellowed light of my desk lamp, I began drying the pages with the patience of a man preserving fragments of thought. The first few were academic Greek quotations, rough translations, notes on flux and permanence. But deeper in, the tone shifted. There was a passage written in haste. She knows about the bridge, told her I'd make it right. She laughed, said truth can't be borrowed, meeting her again after evensong. The ink had bled across the words, but enough remained to summon the image, the bridge, the laughter, the promise. Everything that follows tragedy usually begins in those three. I leaned back, listening to the faint hum of the radiator. The rain had grown heavier, drumming softly against the windows. Lewis returned with tea, still wearing that expression of uneasy loyalty. He asked what I thought it meant. I said it meant we were too late for the truth, but not yet too late for understanding. He told me Rees had withdrawn from his college 2 days after Eleanor's death. Said he'd gone north, perhaps to family. I told him to find an address. He hesitated, then asked the question I'd been avoiding. Did I think Rees killed her? I said no, or rather, not in the way the law defines killing. Sometimes people push others toward the edge without ever touching them. Sometimes guilt is a matter of grammar, a wrong tense, an unspoken word. When he left, I opened the notebook again. One last entry, almost invisible in the damp. She said everything flows. But she was wrong. Some things remain. I closed the cover gently. The phrase felt like a rebuke to her, to him, to me. Perhaps to the whole weary machinery of reason that insists on closure when life prefers echoes. I placed the key beside the notebook. Such a small object, holding so much gravity. It seemed absurd that all our questions about life, death, betrayal, remorse could hinge on something that once fit in the palm of a hand. Outside, the college bells began to sound curfew. Their echoes stretched across the city, rolling through the wet air like a benediction denied. I listened until they faded, then poured myself a whiskey and sat in silence, the key glinting faintly in the lamplight. It no longer felt like evidence, it felt like a memory. It came to me not through evidence, but through accident, as so much of the truth does. A second photograph tucked into the inner sleeve of the notebook we had found in the bicycle's satchel. I had missed it the first time, the paper thin as regret and folded once down the middle, as if someone had hidden it quickly with the urgency of guilt. I unfolded it under the dim desk lamp. The light caught the gloss unevenly, revealing a scene I recognized at the riverbank near Magdalen, though captured in brighter weather. Eleanor stood at its center, not looking at the camera, but at someone just beyond its frame. Her hair was drawn back, the shadow of a smile only half realized. Behind her, the woman from the boathouse, and, to the right, blurred but unmistakable, Havisham. But it wasn't the figures that held me. It was what lay at the very edge of the frame, the corner of a bridge railing, its paint chipped, the same one I had stood beside on the night she died. And in that sliver of metal, reflected faintly, another figure. Male, tall, his face turned slightly, Callum Reese, or so my mind insisted. Yet the reflection was too distorted to be certain, too humanly imprecise. Truth seldom arrives in focus. Lewis found me hours later, still staring at it. He said I looked like a man reading his own epitaph. I told him that photographs are lies of light. They pretend to preserve what time has already begun to forget. He didn't answer. Instead, he asked if the picture changed anything. I said no. Then after a pause, perhaps everything. We took it to the college archive the next morning. The curator there, a pale woman with a voice like parchment, said the image must have been taken during the Trinity Garden fete 2 years earlier. She pointed out the decorations, the bunting, the faint shape of a gramophone under a marquee. A day of music and laughter, preserved now only in silvered fragments. When she handed it back, I noticed a faint indentation on the reverse. Writing, pressed by a pen but never inked, I shaded over it lightly with my pencil. Words appeared like ghosts summoned from their own silence. She said it wasn't over. I left the archive without another word. The air outside was sharp with the scent of rain. I walked through the cloisters, my footsteps echoing softly, the photograph folded once more in my pocket. Lewis trailed behind, silent in the way good men are when they know speech would only bruise the moment. At the gate, I turned toward him. She said it wasn't over. He frowned and asked what I thought it meant. I told him it wasn't the words that mattered, but the tense. Not isn't, but wasn't. The phrase had been written by someone who already knew she was gone. We went back to Havisham's rooms that evening. He opened the door before we knocked, as though expecting confession. His face has aged since our last meeting, and guilt tends to be an efficient sculptor. I showed him the photograph. He studied it too long to be innocent. He said it must have been Eleanor's, that she had asked him to pose for it during the fete, that he'd forgotten it existed. His voice was steady, but his fingers betrayed him, tracing the edge of the image like a man trying to read Braille through remorse. When I asked who had taken it, he said he didn't remember. Few liars bother to invent the details they fear most. Lewis, uneasy, asked again about Reese. Havisham said the boy had promise, though not the kind Oxford rewards. There had been an argument between them over translation or theory, something academic in name only. I pressed further. Had Eleanor been part of it? He said nothing, which was answer enough. That night, alone in my room, I set the two photographs side by side, the one found in the Greek room and this new one. In both, Eleanor was present but apart, her eyes fixed on someone unseen. And in both, a single object connected them to the bridge, the river's quiet witness to all our vanities. The whiskey glass on my desk caught the lamplight like a lens, reflecting the two images into one. I thought of Heraclitus again, the river that never repeats itself, the flow that carries all memory away. But perhaps he was wrong. Perhaps the river won't forget. Perhaps it simply waits for someone foolish enough to listen. I poured another measure and turned the photograph face down. The rain outside had begun to fall again, soft, deliberate, as though reminding me that everything flows and nothing ever truly settles. The path that runs along the river from Folly Bridge to Iffley is one I have walked too many times, though I remember only the silences. It curves in that deceptive way Oxford paths often promise clarity, then leading you somewhere older, sadder. That evening the mist had come down early. The lamps cast their tired halos across the gravel, and the city's noises drifted faintly. Bells, footsteps, a door closing far off. I had almost forgotten what it felt like to expect nothing and still find something waiting. Lewis had called ahead. A student cyclist out early for morning practice had noticed a stain near the bend below the bridge. Not much, just a patch of darkened earth, partly washed away by the drizzle. The constable on duty thought it was rainwater. Lewis hadn't. When I arrived, he was crouched beside it, his breath visible in the air. He said he'd found fragments of glass in the mud. Not from a bottle, but a lens, possibly a pair of spectacles. Nearby, half hidden by reeds, was a piece of torn cloth, grey wool with a fine weave. I recognized it before he did. Haversham's coat. It took only a moment for memory to stir the missing bicycle, the empty office, the unanswered letter, and that smell, faint but precise, copper and soil. Blood always remembers where it came from. We followed the path south, our torches cutting narrow corridors through the fog. The river moved beside us, slow and impenetrable. At the boathouse we stopped. The door hung slightly ajar, swinging on its hinge with a sound like a weary breath. Inside, everything waited as it had been weeks before: the racks, the varnished hulls, the ropes coiled neatly, untouched. But there was something new. A single bicycle leaning against the far wall. Black Raleigh, the same one we'd unlocked with Reese's key. Lewis's voice was low, uncertain. He said perhaps Reese had returned for it. I said perhaps not. The tires were spattered with mud recently, the kind that still clings. I touched the seat, cold, wet. Whoever had brought it here hadn't stayed long enough for the rain to dry. A faint trail of footprints led from the door to the riverbank. They weren't clear enough to follow, but the impression of movement was unmistakable, not walking, running. At the edge, the earth had given way. The mud sloped downward where someone had slipped or fallen. The reeds were bent, the water darkened. Lewis asked if we should call for divers. I told him no, not yet. There are moments when absence speaks more truly than discovery. Back at the path, the first light of morning began to bleed into the mist, washing the sky a thin silver. The bloodstain looked smaller now, less dramatic, as if trying to recede from attention. I found myself tracing the edge of it with my shoe, measuring the distance between that and the bicycle tracks. They were too close to belong to coincidence. Whoever bled here had tried to ride away, or been placed to appear as if they had. Lewis mentioned the Greek note again, the one that said everything flows. I told him it might have been a warning, not a philosophy. The river moves, yes, but so does guilt. And unlike water, Guilt deepens as it runs. We waited by the towpath as the college porter arrived to confirm the coat. He did so with reluctance, his voice cracking once before falling silent. He said he'd last seen Havisham 2 nights ago, leaving Hall after dinner. He'd been walking toward the bridge. Alone. Lewis looked at me then, his expression unreadable. He said what we were both thinking was that it was possible Eleanor Dray had not fallen accidentally, nor had she been pushed. She had been accompanied by the same man whose coat now lay in our evidence bag. I said nothing. There are conclusions that come too easily, and they seldom survive daylight. Still in the grey of dawn, I felt the shape of the case shift as though the river itself had changed direction beneath us. We left the scene just as the rowers took to the water. Their oars dipped rhythmically, cutting through the mist like metronomes of endurance. I envied their certainty, their forward motion. Lewis walked beside me in silence. Behind us, the constable began taping off the path, the red and white ribbons fluttering like faint accusations in the breeze. At the bridge I stopped and looked down at the water. It reflected nothing, not sky, not light, not guilt. Only motion. Beneath its surface I imagined all that had been lost, the glove, the note, the truth. Things too heavy for memory, but too slight for justice. When we reached the car, Lewis asked if I believed we'd find him. I told him we already had. Whether living or not hardly mattered. The dead linger in Oxford, they simply change their rooms. I lit a cigarette, though the taste felt foreign, and watched the smoke drift upward into the dissolving mist. The first bells of morning began to sound across the city, solemn, familiar, almost kind. There was blood on the bicycle path, yes, but there was something worse beneath it. Silence vast, deliberate, and older than both of them. There are moments, rare and uninvited, when a case ceases to be a matter of deduction and becomes instead a kind of requiem not for the dead, but for what dies inside the living. The night I found the lyre was such a moment. It lay on the steps of the chapel, small and wooden, its strings broken, its varnish dulled by the rain. A student's prop, perhaps, or an ornament from one of the music rooms. Yet the sight of it struck me with a quiet finality I couldn't at first explain. Its silence was heavier than sound. Lewis joined me a few minutes later, his breath clouding the cold air. He said the porter had found it that morning and left it sometime in the night. No note, no explanation. But I noticed at once that the porter hadn't a single streak of dried blood across the rim, faint, deliberate, not from injury, but from contact. Someone had carried it with unwashed hands. We took it inside to dry. The chapel was unlit, and our footsteps echoed against the stone as if trespassing. I placed the lyre on the altar rail beneath the flickering gaslight. It gleamed faintly like an object just recovered from a dream. Lewis asked what it meant. I told him it wasn't the object that mattered, but its placement. The chapel door had been locked at dusk. Whoever left it had keys or knew where to find them. There was a music book lying on one of the pews, Odes of Anacreon, Greek text opposite the English translation. I turned to the marked page. The poem spoke of rivers, of loss, of voices drowned by time. The word underlined was phthongos, tone, sound, or more literally, utterance. I traced the ink with my thumb, and suddenly it came Eleanor's handwriting, unmistakable in its precision. I could almost see her, seated here in the dim light, reading that very passage aloud to no one. The image was so vivid I half expected to hear her voice. But Oxford is generous only with echoes. Lewis broke the silence by saying that Rees's bicycle had been found, pulled from the river near Iffley, its frame twisted, its tyres heavy with silt. No sign of him, No sign of Havisham either. I nodded, though I already knew neither would be found easily. The river takes its time with confessions. We searched the vestry. Dust, hymnals, the scent of old wood and wax. On the table by the window, a set of duplicate chapel keys. I held them up to the light, and for the briefest instant noticed the faintest residue on one, a smear of varnish, the same shade as the lyre. I pocketed the keys without comment. There are discoveries one doesn't announce, one simply carries them until they reveal their weight. We left as the first bell of evensong sounded, its resonance slow and exhausted. The college seemed suspended between light and shadow. From somewhere beyond the quad, a piano began to play, halting, uncertain, but unmistakably her tune, the melody from the Greek ode. A student, I told myself. Coincidence? But the thought rang false even as I spoke it. Later, back in my room, I placed the lyre on my desk beside the photograph. 2 images of absence, one frozen in light, the other carved in silence. I poured a whiskey, though I scarcely wanted it. The city outside my window was dark and indifferent, its rooftops glistening with rain. I thought of Heraclitus again. The lyre and the bow are one. Tension, balance, the strings stretched between sound and stillness. Perhaps that was what she had understood, that every truth, like every note, depends on what remains unspoken. Lewis would return in the morning with reports, theories, certainties. He would ask what I believed, and I would answer only that belief is a poor substitute for understanding. The dead, after all, have no need for either. I extinguished the lamp and sat a while in the quiet. The rain against the window grew softer, less persistent. Somewhere in the dark corridors of St. Aldate's, a door closed with the gentlest click, and for an instant I felt the air shift, as if someone had passed through unseen. Perhaps it was only imagination. Or perhaps the silence had finally learned to speak.